Good evening. This is Walter Terry with another in the series, Invitation to Dance. The guest is Rebecca Harkness, president of the Rebecca Harkness Foundation and head of the newly formed Harkness Ballet and the Harkness House for the Ballet Arts. Mrs. Harkness is a lady who has, in the last few years, contributed much of her energy, her time, and her devotion to the development of ballet in America and the training of people for the ballet. That she takes ballet every day, not because she wants to become a ballerina in her company, but because she wants to know in her own muscles what the dancers whom she is supporting experience.
Well, I've always been interested in the dance, and I've always done some physical work myself, whether it's yoga or athletics or different types of dancing.
When did music then come into your life?
I studied piano as a child, and about 20 years ago, I went back to study the piano. And with that, I studied theory of music and harmony, and I began right away to compose popular songs.
And then with your studies, you began moving into the symphonic and suite forms?
Yes, I studied with Nadia Boulanger
you did?
Frederick Burley of the Manners College and other private teachers and Mr. Horby.
In other words, you did a real job of work on your training as a musician.
Yes, I've been studying that for 45 years now.
You have in recent years, I believe I'm correct, through the Rebecca Harkness Foundation, given support for international tours and local presentations to the Robert Joffrey Ballet, which you introduced to the Soviet Union with tremendous success. What was the lack, other than the lack of money, that you felt?
But to answer your question about why I did this, I think there's only one way. There was a famous mountain climber, and they said, "Why do you climb mountains? Why are you going to climb Mount Everest?" And he said, "Because it's there."
The Joffrey Ballet then, we did our own pressing costumes. We took care of the flowers. We took care of, anything that had to do. We washed our own tights and whatever needed to be done. But we had these these cans where we kept our flower pieces, our, things that went on our hair or earrings or something in a separate little tin box. Joffrey was upset when I became pregnant, but I went on tour. 47 cities, was it? And I performed every night.
Well, you were in a station wagon. There were 6 of them, the original 6. You imagine in a station wagon with all those suitcases.
We were so cramped.
And there's scenery panel on top.
Everything was on top.
And one of the dancers drove. But 3, sitting.
Yeah, and we couldn't stretch our legs. This was like, the seats were right like this. And I can't, up to today, if I had to sit like that, I'd go crazy.
Rebecca Harkness was a wealthy woman. She was married to the Standard Oil king, Harkness. He died. She inherited a lot of money. She knew a lot of different artists, and she loved music. And she conceived of herself as an artist. When Robert Joffrey and she met, Joffrey was absolutely destitute. He had no money left. It really looked like they would have to fold.
And then the Joffrey Company, we heard that we were going to do a very special showing for someone, and had no idea what was really going on. But the Joffrey Company rented the Phoenix Theater downtown on 2nd Avenue. And Joffrey said, we're going to do bits and pieces from all the repertoire. So, your costumes are here, and we'll do a little run through in the afternoon, and then you'll do the show in the evening. And I said, okay, there we go. So we went into this theater, which was like a desert. It was a very strange, empty theater. And we started dancing, and we danced all afternoon, and then we took a couple of hours off, and then we did the whole program again. And at the end of every piece, we did our formal bows. You know, we walk forward, bow, and walk back. Nothing. We heard nothing. There was not a sound, not a.
And we did a little showing for a very important person who was in the theater that afternoon to see, snippets of things that we were doing. And it turned out to Mrs. Harkness, and out of that came her sponsorship of the Joffrey Ballet. She took on the financial burden of running the company and making it possible.
So she says, yes, I would like to support your company, but I want you to come to Watch Hill. I think it was for 10 weeks or something amazing. That workshop, I think also in terms of what Harkness did, I think that's one of the most important things that happen in dance. And so he understood that, and Harkness gave them that blissful, glorious summer when they worked with Alvin Ailey and Brian McDonald and Arpino. It was just incredible luxury to have that amount of time to do that.
Spending sort of the whole summer there, creating new works, bringing in choreographers, that was very exciting. Alvin Ailey came, for instance, and there were so many others. Even Jack Cole came, Anna Sokolov. I mean, Bob Joffrey really went over to the modern community and asked them to do work for us. And we traveled a great deal at that time, sponsored by State Department. And we went to the Middle East, we went to India, we went to Russia, Europe. So that was very exciting for young dancers.
He really didn't want her to influence the kinds of ballets that he was doing. He didn't want her to have any say whatsoever in what his decision-making was as the artistic director of that company. And yet at the same time, he had to negotiate and navigate her will to have her music used for different ballets. And he had to kind of compromise, which he didn't like doing very much. Harkness felt so slighted by Joffrey when he did not perform her ballet on one of the tours. I think in Russia they did do it, The Palace. Well, first of all, she disagreed with his taste often. And I think she felt slighted by him. I think she felt like he didn't really like her music and like her work. I think it was very new in a sense in America. How do you deal with a patron who is an artist and sort of fancies herself a significant artist and wants to have a say in that work? Things were being figured out.
I believe, to best of my knowledge, that the attorneys for Mrs. Harkness felt it was only right that since she was paying the bills, that it should be named Harkness Ballet. but she still wanted Mr. Joffrey to be the artistic director. And that was just totally unacceptable to Bob. And so that's where that split happened.
Joffrey felt that what she was asking him was to compromise and asking him to have a kind of deal where, you know, she would have artistic say and she would be kind of obeyed. And that was not what he was going to do. And so he went to the press.
She wanted to change the name to Harkness. He did not want to change the name. And he had every right. So he withdrew, and we didn't hear from him. And we were at wit's end because
Well, yeah,
we
in Watch
didn't know
Hill,
what to do.
Bob suddenly disappeared. He just wasn't teaching.
Yeah, and I started calling him and said, "Oh, Joffrey, please let me know what I should do," because I felt so indebted to Joffrey. He was my main teacher and choreographer since I was so young. And he announced her. And at one point, he finally said, "You do what you need to do." Well, I needed to have a job, so I went with Harkness.
From 62 to 64.
It was the very beginning of Joffrey with Harkness.
Yeah.
The very moment
the first 2 years.
we were there. We were called by Jeannot, and we always felt that we were part of Harkness. I mean, we loved, Bob was the most talented guy in the world, a beautiful choreographer. Unfortunately, we had to raise funds for the company, and I think we lost some of that. But we were always Harkness, you know, from that very first phone call. And there was never any
Transitioners, you know, from Joffrey to Harkness. Life flowed for us.
But I got a call from Jeannot Tironi, who was the general manager or worked for Mrs. Harkness, went over to her apartment over on the east side and signed a contract to go to work for her.
He called us up and said, "You know, we're thinking we're going to make a company. Do you want to be in it?" I said, "Yes," you know.
So the Harkness Ballet began like that, with a pretty big splash. You know, there was a lot of press and there was a lot of involvement, you know, in people trying to find out, you know, what the Harkness Ballet really was and what kind of repertoire did we work on, what did we create. There were many dancers from the Joffrey who went to Harkness. Not all of them, but many. And it was, you know, a pretty strong company right away.
My name is Jack Venza, which is a name that many people in this audience will know from public television. It was a name behind 35 years of public television programming in the arts, and among them was dance in America. But what happened was, I got a call from Bob Joffrey, and he called to say that Mrs. Harkness had offered complete support, and they would have a whole summer in Watch Hill, where she had a house. I've asked Alvin Ailey to create a work, and he suggested you as the designer because you had just designed something for his tour when he went abroad. The piece surprised me that Alvin came up with. It was based on the Lorca play, a dark drama about a family in mourning and the obsessiveness of the mother and her daughters to protect herself from the outside world, and the daughter, the youngest daughter, who wants to go into the outside world. When we first talked about it, I said, "Alvin, how do you imagine this?" He said, "Well, you know, I guess we have to do period costumes. They're all covered up in black." And I said, "But are they going to be able to dance with these big skirts? They're going to have to be big, heavy skirts and everything." It also meant they were very expensive costumes. There were a lot of detail work on them. Our contracts were signed not with Joffrey, they were signed and we were paid for by the Harkness Foundation. It became a very important issue later, because when there was a decision on Bob's part that he could not accept the fact that the company's name would change, and he'd rather withdraw his and all the things he owned, none of us could really object, because all of our all of our payments were by the Harkness Foundation. But it meant that all of the new works Joffrey commissioned, other than Gerald Arpino's, belonged to the Harkness Foundation. And so when Joffrey pulled out, Feast of Ashes went with the Harkness Company's first repertoire.
No, so the question is, who owns the art? So if she paid for the sets and the costumes, and if she paid, if what did she own what she paid for? And nobody really knew the answer to that. This was all new ground and new territory.
When you walk past Carnegie Hall, you heard tap dancing, you heard Russian people teaching ballet, you heard somebody doing opera. You heard it was alive. Just on the street, you heard it. Buildings were filled with dance classes. Luigi had a dance center. He was teaching jazz, big jazz person on Broadway. Dance was a big thing. It was Studio 54. I was at VIP. I didn't have to wait online. How was New York? Drugs were pure. Sex was safer. I took the audition and I was accepted. And next day I took company class and I immediately went to the general manager, Giano Cerrone, a great man. And I said, I'd like to have my contract back. I don't belong in this company. They were all much better than me. They wouldn't give me my contract back. They said I had to stay. I started in the back. It took me 6 years to get up to the front.
Sebastian was the first ballet I was in. And I put on that costume and we rehearsed for a minute. And they were talking me through the ballet on stage. People were yelling things at me and telling me what to do. It was really frightening. That was how I first started.
So I was one of the original members of the company, non-Joffrey dancer who became part of the company. Some did not accept the new situation. So the company, Harkness Ballet, needed extra dancers. So they had audition and I got the contract.
Right after high school, I got myself out of Chicago and went to New York. I had just by chance heard about an audition for the Harkness Ballet, and not knowing really too much about it, I went to the audition. The audition was given by Leon Fokine. George Skabine was the director. Mrs. Harkness was there, and also a very tall man by the name of Bob Sievers. They selected 2 girls for the company, myself and another woman by the name of Miyoko Kato, both of us being rather tall. We're figuring that we probably got into the company because Bob Sievers needed to have some taller dancers in the company.
Well, I know that he's famous for so many things he's done on Broadway, and it was intense. For me, I was pushed, and he really liked me. And I remember one rehearsal in particular, I was in tears, but he was really pushing me. And I finally got a hold of myself and got mad at myself and did what he needed. We wore jazz shoes, so it was just very different and very intense. And I remember the music being great, and you can see the lighting. It was really fun.
Harkness was performing downtown on Broadway, and I knew nothing about it. So I decided to go see the performance. Harkness really brought contemporary out. I think what contemporary is today came from Harkness. I mean, Joffrey was doing stuff, Alvin Ailey was doing stuff, but she put it all together. In the intermission, I went out to the lobby and I said, to somebody I knew or somebody, who's the director here? And they said, oh, he's over there, Brian McDonald. And I went right up to him and I said, excuse me, but I want to be in your company.
Is the policy to balance classical works with those that we might call modern or modern in intent? And do you also include modern dance
I feel very strongly about both. I think we should definitely keep up the traditional technique, but to create our own ballets for that and not do the old ones, which have been done to perfection by everybody. And I don't really see that we can improve on it at this moment. And as far as the modern, I think we've had some wonderful productions. And I think when the modern dancer comes in and understands our technique and uses our dancers as what they can do, the combination of the two is fascinating and very dramatic.
Well, it wasn't only me, my sister also, Maria, told she became a prima ballerina. It was my mother. She had always wanted to be a ballerina, and when we were young, she was determined we would be. So I think I started dancing when I was 3. The one I remember the most was because we toured in Barcelona, because we were there about a month, I think. It was a big success, and Mrs. Harkness was very happy.
I would like to ask you, since Harkness House will open soon, if you would first describe its physical properties as a house, what's in it, and then what you hope to fill it with in terms of the art of dance and the related arts.
Well, I want the dancers to feel that they are at home here, and it is a house. European style, and it has 4 ballet studios.
Big ones too, aren't they?
And each different color to make it attractive. And the snack bar, massage room, and showers, an art gallery, because I think we can have different paintings set up, and I think dancers are too tired to walk through museums. But if we can bring some of that to them, it will help them develop as an all-around human being and artist.
At the very beginning, when the building opened, there was a big celebration, a big cocktail party that my family and I were invited to. A lot of famous people were there. In the picture with me is Leon Danilian, Alexandra Danilova, my father, Igor Yuskevich, and Luigi, the jazz teacher. And I think my impression, it was the most elegant, the grandest building I had ever seen designed for the arts, for ballet.
Salvador Dali was her close friend. He had made an urn for her, a chalice, where her ashes, I expect, went. And it had butterflies that fluttered open, and there were jewels and fluttered back closed again. And an armed guard always sat there. Well, the night of that opening, I happened to be walking from the dressing room to go upstairs, and I was alone, and I look up, and Salvador Dali in a black cape came swooping down the stairs. He had Ocelot on his shoulder. And I was so enamored. I went, ah, and I just watched him come floating down the stairs. It was magnificent.
We were in Barcelona, and Mrs. Harkness has had quite a history with knowing Salvador Dali. Well, in Barcelona, we were in Gaudi Park, and at that time it was the 60s, and it was the happenings, and they had a huge plastic bubble. In the bubble were about 6 dancers from the Harkness and Salvador Dali in the bubble. Inside, he started to throw paint on the sides of the wall and paint on us. And so I was painted by Salvador Dali. And my mother said, "Why didn't you get that leotard sign?"
So, and we all had a blue leotard and pink ties. And that's what it was. It was strange, but fun. It was good strange. He had a lot of strange concepts, and if you see his artwork, it's very kind of out there. You know, I don't know the rhyme or reason of it, but it was delightful to be a part of that.
and wonderful places, you know, to dance on the Riviera, in Cannes, and then to be in residence in Monte Carlo. And we're taking class in the same studio, that's the same building, you know, where Vicky runs off the tower and jumps into the railroad tracks. You know, I mean, you're in all that history where the Ballet Russe was.
When we were in Monte Carlo, all the older dancers were telling us younger ones, we feel the spirits here at the Teatro di Monte Carlo. You know, everybody was into all the greats that had performed on those boards.
Just if you can imagine to be in Monte Carlo, living at the Hotel Hermitage, and Prince Rainier and Princess Grace in the royal balcony. Very beautiful opera house, and with a raked stage, which I'd never been on before.
We had to go through a labyrinth to get to this studio. It was down the hallway, turn left, under, past the velvet curtain, out in the carriageway, back in, down a few more hallways, into this damp old studio with the rotting floorboards and so forth. But that's where the Ballet Russe used to rehearse. So, you know, dance was in the beams. And it was also in our butts, because I remember we often had ballets that where we were dragged and splinters, and yeah, it wasn't ideal.
Stuart Hodes was a dancer in the Graham Company, and he was attempting to cross over into the ballet world. And it was that time too, where people were experimenting with modern dancers, working with ballet company. He came and he found my wife and me, Lona E. Saxon and me, and he wanted to do a piece called The Abyss.
And I did the first duet, just the first duet, because they were lost, you know. Yes. And they were a romantic couple. It was based very much on this Andrea short story, The Abyss. And they were having this discussion that kids would have, you know, is there love? Is it immortal? What is it? Everything about life. And that was my little ballet. And
literally, that was
with Larry,
such
they, you know, I had wonderful music too. Finished the first pas de deux and showed it to Rebecca. And of course, Skibeen was there, and they did it very well in the showing. If I do say so, it was a good pas de deux.
My personal story about that is that we were in Cannes and we were going to do all these premieres in Cannes. And George Skibeen came to pick me up after a rehearsal. So I was in his car and he said, you know, I've promised Eric Bruhn a premiere and I haven't been able to deliver on my promise. So I'm offering him The Abyss. So that was a very unhappy moment. He did the premiere in Cannes, and a couple of weeks later in Paris, I did Abyss, and it was a very big success.
Brian came artistic director. He saw in me that I could move like thunder.
Right. Even with intelligent people like Brian McDowell, I mean, he choreographed a trio for Helgi and Lona and myself, Zealous Variations, which was challenging, but where you really felt you were exploring and using your body and using your mind.
Zealous Variations is simply a classical pas de trois, a reaction to some Schubert variations for one piano, four hands, that Mrs. Harkness found and orchestrated for me in a sparkling, lyric manner.
Now softly to the floor. Hold her, hold her, hold her. Right. You arrived. Stay.
Everybody had seen Harkness Ballet, but never New York. So when it finally was confirmed that the Broadway theater would be definitely ours for the first 3 weeks in November, this is 1967, it was like a birth. And it was a relief and anticipation, about time for the Harkness to be showing what they could do in New York. And he would rehearse and rehearse and rehearse, and we probably would rehearse 8 counts of whatever it was for a good half hour, an hour. It just went on and on and on. And it was always called a work in progress because it never ever got finished. But what an amazing experience.
I was attracted to doing ballets. What I was attracted to really was not doing ballets, but doing work that the dancers felt really good doing. song, Night Song, is based on classical ballet, but has a lot of contemporary stuff in it. It's not a pure classical ballet. It's an abstract work, but it has other things in it.
Rebecca Harkness was really the great American dance patron. She was forward-thinking. She had very passionate ideas about supporting young dance artists, dancers, and choreographers, American dance artists and choreographers, American composers. She really believed in the talent that was homegrown within our shores.
Because this really is the story of America and American arts, and how do the arts get funded? And how does the funding affect the aesthetic and the work that you see on stage? Because it does.
The main critic at the New York Times was just very much against her. And so it was an uphill battle, even for us dancers, to be recognized.
Barnes wrote the worst named review, and he wasn't seeing it from an objective point of view. It was obviously that he had some problem. And it goes back to when Joffrey and Harkness split. And he basically just took a side, and his side that he took was Joffrey. And he hated Rebecca Harkness and the Harkness Ballet. It's very evident when you read his reviews of the company.
We are in a capitalist society, so where you get your money from is going to have an effect on the art. How does the art have an effect on the economic conditions of the United States, on the political conditions, on the social conditions? There's a sense that, it's sort of like now, like we feel with 1%ers, oh, you can do anything you want. You don't have to actually work for it. You can buy beautiful dancers. You can buy costumes whenever you want. You can buy space. You can get a school. This is a time when people are buying art and seeing art as a commodity, and that it's something that you can make a collection of. If you get ahead of the game, you might be able to make some money off of it. The good thing with Harkness is that she's investing in the arts, period. And she was investing in performing art, which is ephemeral. How does patronage work now? Can one person support a whole company anymore? No. How often does a small company perform these days? Do they have big seasons? No. It takes an enormous amount of money to do that.
Is the school open to the general public, or is admission by audition?
Right now, it's admission by audition.
And you want to give the specially talented ones the opportunity.
I think they should all have special attention, because I think it's the only way they can develop it, not in a huge class with 40 people. They'll also have some modern dancing.
Oh, they will. That'll be coming.
Character. and some ethnic, and maybe some acrobatics for those that need it to develop.
What about the program you have for what they call in Europe aspirants or trainees? What is that supposed to do?
Well, I think they would be, you could understand it more if they were referred to like they have interns in the hospital. Just before people become really professional, if they could have a year of experience performing and, you know, not in professional places.
And not subject to the critics.
Not subject to the critics and working with different choreographers. They would be much more secure then when they do go into the professional company.
Why is it that this person can jump higher than the next person? How come this person can turn more than the other person? Because before that, you know, we were just classified. You are a jumper, you know, or you don't jump, you cannot do this. You know, you don't turn, you cannot do this part. We need a turner. So, you know, nobody thought that anybody could learn to do anything.
Well, Joanna was a brilliant woman. She was absolutely brilliant. And she had quite a bit of knowledge, mostly about anatomy, but she didn't really have that much knowledge about kinesiology. She knew that what it was, but she wasn't really an expert. I had studied kinesiology, so I taught Joanna kinesiology to add to her anatomy, which was an interesting project. So we went to Harkness. Pat Wilde was the director. So Pat Wilde was very strict in what she believed should happen. And so she and Joanna used to get into these discussions. I got along with Pat. I was the ham and the sandwich because I got along with Joanna, I got along with Pat Wilde, and I used to run back and forth between them. And Mrs. Harkness wanted somebody to be trained this way to teach in the school and the company. So Mrs. Harkness took David Howard and sent him to Spain to me. So I did teacher training to David Howard for 3 months in Spain. And Mrs. Harkness decided that he should be the one to teach the company. And of course, he was beautifully trained in England. So he, very smart. David would plan classes that would incorporate this, but without really giving it a name and talking. He would just put it in the combinations. So he taught the Harkness company for years, for a long time. Finest was one of them, Larry Rhodes was one of them, Dennis Wayne was one of them. They were all in that company. And so even the ones that said that they really weren't part of Joanna's group, they absorbed a great deal from David because that's the way he taught. It was a very interesting 4 years of my life.
Well, the Harkness Research and Training Session was one of the very first innovative dance training programs. The training program was developed in such a way that even if you didn't have a perfect body, you could move that body very, very well. And it was all movement oriented. And we had kinesiologists and people who worked with the body. We had the ability to have all of the medical people who had anything to do with movement involved. And it evolved from that wish to have a much more knowledgeable way of doing things rather than a rote way, because you have all these little soldiers lined up that look like one another. The first couple of years went by, and all of a sudden we were having dancers coming out of the womb, 1, 2, 3, 4, like that. Then we were accepted. And we wound up in 1 year putting more dancers in companies than all of the other schools together.
I was just like, you get on that bus, and the company is going to this farm house or barn. And we went and march out and get in that barn, sit down, and someone said, there's gonna be a vote, so just vote yes. So I'm like, okay. And there was a vote, I think, to vote Brian out.
I said, Brian, I think the question is, are you going to be here all the time with the company? Can you? Will you be here now with the company all the time? And he turned to me and he said, yes, I will. That's what the whole meeting was about, you see? And so the meeting, we went to dinner. But that was, I would say, a sign of what had been happening. And I think it was too late.
And so I said, all right, I'm going to get on a plane and go to New York and talk to Mrs. Harkness. And she said, you know, what would you do if you took over? Well, I said, well, I have some ideas too. In retrospect, it probably was the first little nail in the coffin for me. It was certainly hard. And then I went to Mrs. Harkness and said, I think I need a co-director because doing all the work that I do as a director and dancing all the time, it's just too much, too much. So she said, okay. And I hired Benjamin Harkness.
I think in 6 years we were there, I think we had something like 6 directors. Some lasting not very long and some lasting a little bit longer.
I think being a director is probably the hardest thing in the world too. And I don't think there's ever a director that is happy at the end of their term. You know, I don't think Larry was happy at the end of his term, and Brian certainly, you know, it was hard.
The Harkness youth dancers were this small group of people from the school who basically were doing public schools around New York. So they created a program. There were obviously works that Mrs. Harkness enjoyed very much, and she enjoyed being around them. In the meantime, we were off in Europe and running around and having a good success, but of course costing money.
Well, it was an exciting opportunity when Mrs. Harkness offered me the job to direct the youth dancers. For one thing, the young dancers I loved. It was a way of me starting. I had not directed before. And although I'd done some teaching, it was a great way for me to have the opportunity to gain experience. And so I was very anxious to do this. When I look back on it, I don't think of it as a bad time, but it's a very good time for me, which gave me great opportunities. But there were strange undercurrents that went on, and I don't know all the answers, but she did become very, very involved in what ballets we would do and who would choreograph them. But I do know that Robert Sievers had a lot of things he wanted to achieve with the company. And I think he also, at one time, said to me, you know, that one day he wanted to end up directing one of the companies, you know. So I think he had that in mind. And also he was very, very close to Mrs. Harkness. So the more they got together and artistic decisions were made, not only of the ballets, but who would dance in them.
Nobody was paying attention to what she wanted anymore. We did a lot of modern work. She wanted more classical works, although we did a lot of classical works too.
I think the comment that rolled around was that we spent so much time on the floor, rolling on the floor. And she was basically a classicist, even though she brought in people like Alvin Ailey, Joan Butler, you know, to work with the company. So she was done, and the company was done.
I think in the end, in its most simple form, this was her ballet company. This is what she paid for, every single one of us. All the ballets, all the theaters, she paid for everything. And I think she just felt like she got to do what she wanted to do.
But I know there was a feeling that we were out of New York for so long. We were touring Europe, but we weren't really doing New York seasons. And I know from others, they felt that this was detrimental to the company.
At one point, Larry Rhodes and Ben Harkarabi were directors of the company. They directed the company. And I seem to recall something to the fact that they gave an interview to the press. What I heard, they thought it was off the record, and it was not printed as being off the record. And I think it was not terribly flattering to Mrs. Harkness, what they had to say about her. And I think that was one of the reasons that she dismissed them.
What she did, there were 40 dances. 20 she got rid of. She wanted to keep the other 20 to put them with her second company of 20 and make one company with 40. Of the 20 dances she kept, 19 said, goodbye. You fired the best director we ever had, Larry Rhodes. Only one stayed.
And so we got the telegram, and that was devastating. Our last performance just killed everybody. Jeannot, I think it was Jeannot, and Ariane, Elizabeth's daughter, handed us all, we all came out to take a bow, and handed each and every one of us a red rose, which took a long time. Ariane was, what, 5? Took a long time, and we were all crying and crying and crying.
With Harkness Ballet, it was just the whole company was gone, and then it was suddenly the youth dancers were the company. So it was a completely different company.
We were kids in the school, and when I was with people like with Jeanette and Zane, we were kids. Trainees performing at the Delacorte Theater, you know, really good dancers, really good kids, I mean, but we were young.
A lot of new ballets that were done just for the company, and a very different kind of repertoire. It wasn't classical ballet, it wasn't just modern pieces, it wasn't a jazz group, a real eclectic mix.
Basically just worked with Ben Stevenson, Robert Stevens, and Vincente Librado. That's it. I knew no one else. And these are the same people who trained me when I was 16.
Mrs. Harkness really wanted a company with students that were trained through her school. Very much like what Ben Stevenson does in Houston, what Balanchine did. You know, it's very. Those were the times when you really wanted a school that you could nurture your students to become company members, so they had the right style for you.
There was a sense of drawing in talent. That talent was more important than anything else. Talent was the overriding factor in bringing dancers into the Harkness Ballet, and that seemed to be what attracted people to the company as well.
Mrs. Harkness was fascinated when she interviewed me, and she loved the idea of my culture, and she loved the flamenco. She insisted the company take flamenco. And I remember saying, wow, this is a ballet company.
I got back to New York looking for a job. By chance, I was seeing a performance at the Met. I ran into Mrs. Harkness and a gentleman named Renzo Rice. So I just went back with the company.
I was really little.
I looked like I was about 12 years old. I was tiny. I was like barely 5 feet tall and really skinny and looked very, very young. And Renzo felt that I looked too young to be in the company. But Maria and David really wanted me in there. And I had learned this classical Spanish solo on point, and I played castanets very well. And in the solo, I did fouettes while playing castanets. So it was a dun, 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 dun. And my arms were like this. I'm playing castanets, I'm doing the fouettes and playing castanets in rhythm. So they had me do this solo for Mrs. Harkness. And she said, I want that girl in the company.
Several of us were taken to New York. I remember it was boys, especially like 3, 4, 5 boys. Rebecca had a dance festival, which was part of Joseph Papp's Shakespeare in the Park. And the trainees performed.
I mean, it was also being young like that and coming first into a career. It was like doors were just opening to the magic of what that really was.
As much as the first company was Mrs. Harkness's company, the second company was her baby.
So Harkness, it was different. Everything I did was new. I did some of the resurrected stuff and some of the classical standard pieces, but Sebastian, Gemini, it was just like everything was for the Harkness Ballet. It was done for the Harkness Ballet.
If a choreographer likes you or feels that you're the right person for them, they'll create a ballet for you or whatever. I don't know really how it came about. I just know that one day I was in the corps dancing principal roles and I was like, this is strange.
We could participate as trainees in the Firebird, but as the Russian icons on top of this 10-foot-high piece of scenery that was moved, and we had these heavy costumes, and we had to hold the trumpets at the end for the wedding. And I was so frightened. This thing was like shaking, and never to dream one day I would actually do the Firebird. So for me, it was a great leap.
It was a bit scary to do it as a film, and we traveled to Berlin to do it. We spent several weeks, few weeks, I think, if I remember, rehearsing on a stone floor, cement floor, which the movie studio had, small space. So it was very unlike doing it on stage.
And Vicente was, for me, sort of exotic South American who spoke in funny language. He had a long mustache, he smoked a cigarette, and he talked at the same time, half in Spanish, half in English. The idea was we had these men in the school and in the junior company, and said, well, it was like, let's showcase them.
He was always very open to making changes, to adapt new things from the dancers. He always worked on the dancer he had in front of him.
I had a bunch of instruments, and step by step and measure by measure, we were going to create a ballet.
And also being just an unusual piece in that it's just percussion was very exciting for all of us, and also for him to be there, creating it and everything. It was for us, again, it was a growing experience to have gone through that, and for it to still be alive and to still be performed today, I think is a testament to its lasting value.
When I went back to work on the girls' ballet, it was a little bit different. I went into the studio one morning in the RCA's big room in Madrid, and it was at that point we discovered that they didn't speak English and I didn't speak Spanish, and we decided that it would be best if I went back to the States and did the recording there.
Absolutely, positively, the most incredible experience of my life, because we went to Europe and we went every place in Europe and we went every way to go every place in Europe. We took a bus tour in Spain that lasted 1,000 years, and we stopped at every little town doing their Saints' Day celebration. Stages set up on cafeteria tables that were all wired together with a linoleum over the top.
I went on all tours with the company from 1970 till 1975. The tours took us all over France, Spain, Portugal, Germany, Italy, Greece, Lebanon. Problems we might have had on tours, mostly in the outdoor venues, and when that happened, the floor became very wet and slippery. Sometimes we needed to cancel or get stagehands to wipe up the floor.
We danced in certain areas, like certain areas had theaters, others had bull rings. So they would set up a stage at the end of the bull ring, and it was like a portable stage. And our dressing room, I can picture this, our dressing room in one of the bull rings was this humongous room. No bathroom, bucket, whatever.
And somebody said you have to watch out for red costumes, red capes, because the bulls were right there, right next to us. We had to pass the bulls on the way to the stage, yes.
So we were flown to Gestalt. Mrs. Harkness had bought a chalet, which had turned that chalet into studios. And the next chalet next to the studio was her own chalet where she lived.
So I joined them in Baalbek. And it had a strip of stage that was not very big, but I got them all up in the rocks. So they when they made entrances, because we couldn't hide them the way they had been, we didn't have the lighting, the sophisticated lighting that we had in his proscenium stage. So I had to restage their entrances and so on and so forth. So I put them up so you saw them walk down from behind a pillar but walk down these steps, and then they would finally arrive on the strip of Marley and they'd do their dance. And it was just a magical time, really magical. We went from Baalbek, we went to Greece, to Athens, and danced at the Herodaticus Theater, which is underneath the Acropolis.
So we were getting ready to go to Paris from Athens.
And we were in our hotel, and I don't remember exactly if we were getting onto the bus or if we were just got an announcement to get off the bus because war had been declared. Turkey had invaded Cyprus, so Greece mobilized its army. The airport shut down. We were kind of stuck in our hotel. They didn't know what was going to happen next. One day, Jeannot Chironi said, "Okay, nobody say anything. Get your suitcases and come outside and get on the bus." The bus took us to the port of Corinth in Greece. And apparently, Mr. Chironi had secured berths for all of us on a cruise ship, an overnight ferry that went from Corinth to Italy, to Ancona, Italy. And so we kind of snuck onto the boat and we got our berths, and the boat took off, and there we were on a Mediterranean cruise.
Did you have in mind, though, the great court theaters of Europe?
I think the environment's very important. I couldn't just put blobs or squares or cubes.
Very exciting time. I mean, we were opening a theater. I mean, we're opening a theater that was designed for dance. Mrs. Harkness bought this old movie theater on Broadway and transformed it into this absolutely exquisite theater. And the stage was perfect. No dressing room was more than a flight of stairs, a small flight of stairs away. So you never had, never had to hurt your leg going up tons of stairs or something. She was very, very kind to us. That night, the opening night, I did 2 ballets. One was Vicente Nebrada's Sebastian, and the other one was Todd Bolander's Souvenirs. We were there for 2 weeks opening the theater, so we did our whole repertoire there.
The critics were very enthusiastic about the dancers. They were critical of the theater itself. There were 2 world premieres, maybe more than that. Brian McDonald's The Lottery, Margot Sappington's Rodin Mise en Vie.
They had already had their opening night. This was the 17th of April was my premiere, and it was her birthday. She arrived in this golden gown with her golden Salvador Dali tiara that was just like something the Statue of Liberty would wear. It was this Dali spiked golden tiara. She was radiant, and she had chosen it she had seen rehearsals. She wanted it on her birthday. This was her birthday present. The second night, which was the 21st of April, they put Rodin last on the program. At the end of the performance, they screamed my name, and it was like just this thrilling, this kind of shocking moment. It was a thrilling moment. It really was.
I had some ideas, and I would say to Zane and Linda, the 2 people who danced this, can you guys come over into the little studio? I want to just see what something looks like. And that's really what it came out of. I had some things going on in my head, and I wanted to see them. And it seemed to me that every piece of dance that had a couple in it was about rage or destruction, and I kept wanting to see a nice, romantic, happy pas de deux. So that's really what came out, and Mrs. Harkness liked it, so she said, "Well, let's put it on."
Of course, the thing that always comes up is your personal wealth, which people are curious about.
I think a lot of other people are given credit for having a hell of a lot more money than I do, because I can only just carry so much.
Was this your idea to a method of helping dance companies other than your own?
Yes, I think we'd get a board of directors, some grants to pick up the deficit.
We left because it was time to go for us.
We were hearing rumors that Harkness was not doing well. They heard about our campaign, the SOB, and somebody said that they tried to emulate this in New York to get money for Harkness Ballet. And why didn't it work? Because a lot of people said, wait a minute, hold it. Why am I donating to a multi-millionaire?
There was a crash in the market, especially having to do with oil shares. And I think a lot of Rebecca Harkness's fortune was tied up in oil. So she was just not having enough income anymore. She was supporting several other companies and endeavors as well. Pearl Primus, I think, got support. Jose Greco got support. She supported performances in Central Park. She was a true philanthropist and put her money where her heart was.
I believe Mrs. Harkness was very ill at the time, and I think she, when she opened the theater, she was pretty well criticized a lot for some of the choices of her ballets. There were some very bad reviews about her. I don't really particularly, I think it was terribly unfair that they were criticizing her. Here she was giving them New York, a beautiful theater. She had a gorgeous company. There was only 4 companies in New York at the time. And I think that people were just mainly, I don't know, sometimes they just felt jealous perhaps, or they didn't think that the company was very good, whatever their opinion is. But I don't really know what was the final demise of it all, except everything sort of started tumbling down in the mid-70s.
Basically, the gist of it was there was no longer a company, and we were going to finish the US tour, and after this tour, it's done.
The company folded in 1975. Very sad day for me.
I remember we were in Miami in 1975, in March. And during our last bows, we were bowing and we were all crying, and it was awful. But, well, because everyone would split up and a great era was over. And Mrs. Harkness was so wonderful to us. And, well, it was a sad moment.
It was a volatile time. You know, as exciting as it was, as free and spontaneous as things were in many ways, there was a growing tension. After the 60s and 70s, things got a little tighter, a little more straight-laced, a little more back to the routine and back to the traditional ways.
In the 80s and 90s, it became very much more trendy for corporate types to not only give themselves to the ballet financially, but to go to the ballet, go to the opera and the symphony. And so I think that if that had not happened and there had not been more corporate support, that we should again look back at Mrs. Harkness with great, great appreciation.
I saw Harkness, I think 72, 73 in Nice in France, and it was amazing. So when Nikita Town came and he watched rehearsal, and then he said, would you come and work for us? Because I have a plan to start Harkness Dance Theater, which is a youth version of what the company used to be, because now we do not have the same funds. And Rebecca, Mrs. Harkness, wanted to do something. So I said, I'd like that. So I came to teach a few classes, and then They made a contract, and it meant my first working permit to come to the USA. But the first 6, 7, 8 months, if I remember, was exhilarating because there were so many talented people.
I was the last group that Rebecca auditioned for the Harkness trainee program. And that was maybe 76, I think, 75 or 76. And Christopher Aponte came to direct the tour of Taiwan. And he was just so amazing. I never worked with anyone like that. When I left Harkness, I danced with Kansas City Ballet under the direction of Todd Bolander, and then with Mary Day's company, the Washington Ballet with Chusan Go. And then I've had my school for about 30 years now.
And I came from the second company of Houston Ballet to become a trainee under David Howard at Harkness in 1973. I danced with several incarnations of Harkness, one with Alfonso Catá and Willie Berman, and then went back years later with Robert Sievers and Nikita Tallon, and I'm now a chef. I have 2 stars in the New York Times. I run a jazz club, and I have a secret supper club called 10 Chairs.
I was there when a lot of the changes were going on. It was the end of Maria Vey's time there, and David Howard was there for 1 more year. Then he was gone, and then Renita Exter took over as director when Willie Berman and Alfonso Catá came in, and we did ballet on Broadway, which I think is the last performance that the Harkness did in a professional theater.
It's at the Beacon.
Yeah, it was at the Beacon Theater. And then they were gone, and then it was Bobby Sievers and Nikita came in, and I think that's when I left. I'm pretty sure that's when I left. I make tutus for a living, which is hilarious. Every time I say it, I can't believe it. You know, when I was at Harkness, we had a lot of old tutus that had never been washed or cleaned because there was no costume person there. And I remember I used to smuggle them, I shouldn't tell anybody this, I used to smuggle them out in my dance bag and take them home and throw them in the wash, wash them.
Ruth Petrinovic and Maria Vey, they taught a very different way. It wasn't just like point your feet, pull up, and put your arm in this way. It was a very kinesiological study into how the body moves. But I also think the musicality that it taught us, because we had great pianists. We had a beautiful, most
Ray
Wilson and John Childs, who were, fantastic pianists. They didn't just play 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. It went on as a sonata, and you had to go and you had to phrase it. But it was a different way of learning how to count music, and musicality was a very important part of how we were taught.
It's using the laws of physics. That even though you had all these different teachers, there was such a cohesiveness about it. There was, you went into class in the morning, and then the one you went into in the afternoon, there was a continuation. There was always, it made sense. And then at the very end, it just didn't make sense anymore.
And Nikita was a very controlling individual, and I think that was a time when Rebecca's health was failing. She was not really involved in the school at all anymore, and she had always been involved, in the school. She would come to the performances, she would come to all these things, and she was always there. And for whatever reason, there was no one to stand up to. There was no one to say, no, you can't do this and you can't do that. So, and some people need that. Some people need that, sort of focus. And Nikita was not a focused person. It would be one time, run over there, do this, and we'll call it scrambled eggs. And I'm not joking. He would make it split for hours and hours.
Lit cigarettes under your
legs and say, that is true.
After Renita Exter left, because then Maria was gone, David was gone, Anne was gone. They were all
right.
Then everybody was new, and I'm not sure that they all knew each other even.
Right.
It was like people would come in and teach and leave.
Right. So every man for themselves.
Yeah.
It wasn't not a cohesive school anymore. It was just a bunch of teachers.
By the time I got there, Rebecca was already fairly ill, Mrs. Harkness. And so they were really more in how do we transition without her leading this ship into some viable organization that's producing, you know, according to her wishes and her hopes and her dreams. What we did do was choreography workshops. And David Parsons, who now has his own big company, he did his first choreography in Studio B, which is some little Spanish music. It was always Rebecca's baby, even until her death, and even after her death, because it just continued being a Harkness Foundation operation.
And I went upstairs and sat down and talked to Nikita, and they gave me a full scholarship that same day. And then I told Nikita I was really a choreographer. When my second ballet was done there, Roommate A, it was supposed to be, I told you, about mental illness. But it was done in such a humorous way. The people laughed all the way through it. And I didn't know if they got the point, but they did. And I'm sitting in the cafeteria, my back is turned, and I had my little tie on, my Versace jacket. I thought it was so cute. And my back is turned to the doorway, and I'm talking to the dancers. We're having a good time, and all of a sudden the whole room got quiet. And this hand comes on my shoulder, this Mrs. Harkness, and she said, "Keep up the good work." And then she turned and didn't speak or look at anybody else and just left.
Well, getting the urn out of the niche into which it had been deposited turned out to be a really crazy production, because there had to be somebody on the 4th floor doing certain things, electronic things, that was coordinated with somebody in the basement doing the certain things. They finally got the thing open. So they took it out, and they had made a little canister to go inside, because it was a clockwork thing. I mean, it had butterflies opening up and turning around and all this stuff. So if you looked inside it, there was like a spider webs or the wires and things in there. But they made this little canister that was really not big enough for half of her. And so Robert took the wax paper out of the box with the ashes, and he literally shook it into the urn, put the chalice back in the thing, and everybody left.
When I was researching all the material about Rodin's life to do the ballet, it was very important to me that I knew about him, and I knew what his character was and what his life was like. That was all very important to my dialogue about each one of the pieces. I wanted the kiss to reflect his relationship with Camille Claudel. She was a young sculptress. They started a very, very, very passionate affair. She wanted him to leave Rose Beret, who was his partner. He wouldn't do it. The kiss is, to me, the height of the passion of their relationship. In the end, the man walks away. That reflects what actually happened in their relationship. He modeled the figure of the woman in the kiss from her. She is the kiss.
those lovely people out there in the dark. All those friendly little people. And it's so plush and elegant, and they had these, she loved the blue, and she had these heavy blue velvet drapes, and they were perfect for wrapping yourself in, And so Christopher and Aponte and I were in, and I was wrapping myself, and I noticed all of a sudden he started slipping away as I was in. I was like, "Where are you going?" And he ran where they used to sit, that person, the receptionist. So he ran around there, and down the stairs comes Mrs. Harkness. And it was amazing. That two-piece suit, I think it was like white and mustard, and the hair pulled back. And I was like, freak, because I couldn't get out of the curtains. And they're heavy curtains, so, it's like you just... The velvet curtains. The velvet curtains. So I'm hanging them, and she comes down the stairs, and she looks at me, and she says, "Hello, Charles." And she keeps walking. And and Christopher comes back and goes, "She say anything?" I know. She said hi. He goes, "Oh, I should have stayed." You missed it. Yeah.
I think the biggest trouble I got into was the day I alone hopped out of class when they weren't looking and went upstairs. What's up there? Let me explore the fourth floor. Is there a fifth floor?
Did you go to the red room?
I went to the rooftop. I went to the roof and I opened the door and it was like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. And I saw the rooftop of Harkness House, and I started doing West Side Story. Boy, boy, crazy boy. And just living and running, and I leapt to the other rooftop, and I was, turning and just living and loving it. I was out of class. That was the best part, and I was free. Well, the doors flew open, security... The guys were all there, and I said, "What? Oh my God!" What happened was I had danced all the way to another building, which was some Middle Eastern embassy, and I was on top of their roof. Yes, I was on top of their roof, dancing and partying and living, and the security, on top of their embassy. You don't know what that is and who's sort of dancing. Yes, because it's right next to Harkness at the time. I can't remember if it was Afghanistan or
that was really, I think Mrs. H had a lot to do with me getting the whiz. I sort of played hooky from Harkness with their ABT. And it was when their American Ballet Theater was on 57th Street. Because I loved the teacher Pereslovic, Madame Pereslovic. And this is just how teachers were. I had gone away and did the touring with the Wiz, and then after a year I came back. I decided I'd take class from Madame Perry, and I said, "Excuse me, Madame, I've been on tour and I haven't had a class in a year." And she looked at me and she said, "Charles, whose fault